Modelo Especial, the beer born with the fighting spirit in 1925, will be the focus of my corporate campaign analysis. Even if you haven't tried the beer yourself, you've likely seen or heard of it, as the company has done a really good job in the last 5 or so years of making the beer ubiquitous in America since, according to Forbes, they launched their first full English-speaking campaign in 2015. Specifically, I will be focusing on the Fighting Spirit campaign, which features different fighting taglines, including Fighting for Respect, Fighting to Uphold Heritage, and Modelo's Fighting for Change project. The goal of the campaign is to establish for the brand the kind of tough, gritty, fighting credibility that a cage fighter, for example, has. The connections are made in order to market the product to hardworking consumers who feel they too have a little bit of the fighting spirit in them. A commercial featuring a montage of mixed martial arts training set in shadowy lighting and an interactive VR game sponsored by Modelo to better associate the brand with the UFC are the exemplars I've chosen to represent Modelo's campaign's use of design choices as well as their use of convergent media respectively. The third example I'll focus on is the use of cage fighters as representatives of the corporate identity Modelo tries to establish with the campaign, which is, again, one of the fighting spirit. The commercial I've chosen as the exemplar for the design and aesthetic of Modelo's Fighting Spirit campaign features UFC featherweight Brian Ortega. The commercial first aired, according to Forbes, in 2019. In the commercial, we see Ortega training in the gym. He's fighting in the octagon as well, and at the end of all this hard work, we see Ortega sharing Modelo's with his trainers in the gym. The gym is cast in dark shadows. All of the scenes in the commercials have this dark, gritty aesthetic. When talking about the use of color, Ramage and Bean used the example that a poster with psychedelic colors of a 60s rock concert would not be effective if aimed at conservative audiences. I think this is analogous to the commercial because working class people, first generation fighters like Ortega, and nice simple beer drinkers, the audience that Modelo is targeting, will respond to a flashy, colorful aesthetic with the same averse reaction as the conservatives to the tie-dye. Modelo made a choice to use dark colors to establish an ethos of grittiness and hard work, the same way that Ortega has done throughout his professional career. And the designers saw the shadows and dark lighting as Chet calls it, the morally appropriate choice to borrow some of Ortega's credibility in order to establish their own. Now I'd like to shift away from the use of commercial advertising to a really cool part of the campaign, which utilizes virtual reality gamer technology, and I'm referring to the Modelo UFC Fighting Spirit VR Challenge, which simulates for users a fight in the octagon. According to GrooveJones.com, Modelo brand ambassadors across the southern United States set up the game at bars and events during UFC fights in hopes of providing a unique consumer engagement tool that is sure to stand out with both Modelo and UFC fans. Modelo's goal of connecting the two brands in this tech-mediated way is a good example of how the campaign converges media. According to Jenkins, as cited in Dwyer, convergence refers to the flow of both commercially produced products as well as content that reflects the lives, relationships, and desires of audiences through multiple platforms and mediated channels. Users of the Fighting Spirit VR Challenge, which are potentially made up of beer and UFC fans, get into a more intimate relationship with both products. They experience entertainment and advertising for multiple brands through multiple technologies, ostensibly connecting them to both brands, the technology, as well as the fighting spirit ethos. The fighting ethos that Modelo has embedded in their corporate brand made a partnership with the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, a good fit, which is why Modelo replaced Bud Light as the official beer of the promotion in 2017. Multiple UFC fighters are featured in these ads, such as Stipe Miocic and Brian Ortega, in order to associate the fighters' stories of hard work and perseverance to Modelo's brand. This process of creating brand associations is related to what Johansson calls identity construction, which is done by telling stories that are considered a preferred way of creating and constructing meaning. Modelo's marketing team had the idea that championing the stories of cage fighters, specifically those with an immigrant background like Miocic and Ortega, could be the preferred way of constructing their own identity, symbolic of the spirit of the UFC and their fighters, but separate in that the beer, of course, is a standalone product. Modelo was happy to champion the story of a first-generation Mexican-American veteran of the UFC, like Ortega, to establish some of their own credibility because they were acting as a narrated organization. They chose Ortega as a narrative, an anchor for their narrative, and this is clear, the reason they chose him, from Ortega's recollection of how Modelo representatives pitched the idea to him. They said, "You are what we're looking for the fighting spirit." So, Modelo wants you to drink their beer. Plain and simple, that's the number one thing. Sales are the number one thing, and everybody knows that. But in order to increase sales, companies understand better than ever that the product must be connected to a brand. And a brand is best established when its bedrock is a strong corporate identity that can act as a narrative for the company and be spread through multiple diverse platforms. The identity Modelo wants to create is similar to that of a cage fighter: tough, gritty, and hardworking. What better way then to embody the narratives of real fighters and spread their stories with corporate sponsorship, all while embracing a dark aesthetic and connecting to an already established UFC brand? Modelo's fighting campaign doesn't make you want to fight, nor does it necessarily make you want to go out and drink a beer. But what it does is it does a really good job of associating that kind of feeling that you get when you think of hardworking immigrants, fighters. That's that feeling that you get when you think of those things. The brand is connected to that through the campaign. Now, having said all that, excuse me while I enjoy this Corona.